Let's begin with what seems like confidence, but is actually illusion. When you're dealing with an avoidant, what you often witness on the surface is calm detachment. They appear composed, unaffected, even in control. And for a long time, that perception holds, because the dynamic has trained them to believe it's true. You see, avoidants don't just distance themselves from others. They distance themselves from emotional accountability. Over time, they build a psychological framework where closeness feels optional and disconnection feels safe. In that framework, your presence becomes something they assume will always orbit back, not because they consciously disrespect you, but because they've never fully experienced the consequences of losing you. So when you start pulling back, when your energy shifts, when you stop reaching, stop explaining, stop trying to fix what they refuse to face, they don't immediately panic. In fact, they often interpret it as part of the familiar pattern. They just need space. They'll come back. This always happens. That's the illusion of control speaking. But here's the deeper psychological truth. Control, in this context, was never real. It was conditional. It was built on your consistency, your patience, your emotional availability. You were the stabilizing force in a dynamic that they never had to fully invest in. And because you kept showing up, they never had to question what would happen if you didn't. The moment you truly step away, not as a tactic, not as a test, but as a decision, that illusion begins to fracture. And it doesn't shatter all at once. It cracks quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, there's still confidence, still distance, still the belief that nothing fundamental has changed, but something has. Because for the first time, the avoidant is no longer responding to your presence. They're responding to your absence. And absence is a language they don't speak fluently. It's unfamiliar territory. There's no script for it, no emotional shortcut, no way to maintain the same sense of control when the variable you has been removed entirely. What makes this stage so critical is that it sets the foundation for everything that follows. The denial, the anxiety, the internal conflict, all of it begins here, in this subtle but profound shift. The moment where the external dynamic changes, but the internal narrative hasn't caught up yet. And that gap, that space between reality and perception, is where discomfort is born. Because on some level, even if they won't admit it, they begin to feel it. A slight disruption, a break in the pattern. The silence feels different this time. Not reactive, not temporary, but final. And when control was never about strength, but about predictability, losing that predictability becomes destabilizing. So what you're witnessing isn't indifference, it's delay. It's the mind trying to preserve a version of reality that no longer exists. And eventually, that effort becomes unsustainable. Because the truth doesn't announce itself loudly, it reveals itself through absence. And when the illusion of control finally gives way to reality, one thing becomes undeniable. They didn't lose control of the situation. They lost the one person who made that control possible. And once that illusion of control begins to crack, the mind does what it's designed to do. It protects itself, not with truth, but with comfort. This is where denial steps in. Not as weakness, but as a psychological buffer against a reality that feels too abrupt to accept. Because for the avoidant, your absence isn't immediately processed as loss. It's reframed, reinterpreted, minimized. They tell themselves a story that preserves their emotional distance. They just need time. They've done this before. They always come back. And on the surface, it sounds reasonable, because historically, it may have been true. But denial isn't about logic, it's about timing. It delays the emotional impact long enough for the psyche to maintain its sense of stability. And in this stage, the avoidant leans heavily on past patterns to justify present inaction. They don't reach out, not because they don't notice your absence, but because they believe reaching out isn't necessary yet. This is where something subtle but important happens. They begin to observe without engaging. They might check your social media, revisit old messages, think about you in quiet moments. But instead of interpreting these behaviors as signs of concern, they frame them as curiosity, as control, as if they're still the ones choosing distance rather than being placed into it. And this is the paradox of denial. It creates the illusion of power in a moment where power is quietly slipping away. Because while they're telling themselves you'll return, you're actually moving forward. While they're relying on emotional history, you're rewriting your emotional future. And the longer denial persists, the wider that gap becomes. There's also a deeper layer here, one rooted in identity. Avoidants often define themselves by independence, by self-sufficiency, by the ability to not need. So accepting that someone might truly be gone, that they might have mattered more than expected, challenges that identity at its core. Denial protects not just their feelings, but their self-concept. So instead of asking, what if they're really gone? They ask, when will they be back? It's a subtle shift, but a powerful one, because one question invites reality, the other avoids it entirely. But here's the truth about denial. It has an expiration date. Reality doesn't argue with denial. It outlasts it. And as days turn into weeks and your silence remains consistent, something begins to change. The assumptions start to feel less certain. The confidence becomes quieter. The distractions lose their effectiveness. And the narrative they've been telling themselves starts to feel incomplete, because denial can only survive in the absence of evidence. And your continued absence becomes the very evidence it cannot explain. This is where the discomfort deepens, not dramatically, but persistently. A thought that lingers a little longer, a question that doesn't resolve as easily, a realization that begins to form just beneath the surface. What if this time is different? And that question is the beginning of the end for denial. Because once the mind entertains uncertainty, it can no longer fully return to illusion. The emotional wall that once felt solid now has cracks. And through those cracks, reality starts to seep in. Not all at once, not in a way that's easy to confront, but enough to disrupt the story they've been telling themselves. And when denial finally begins to fade, it doesn't collapse dramatically. It dissolves quietly, leaving behind something far more unsettling than distance. The possibility that you're not coming back. And once denial begins to loosen its grip, something far less comfortable takes its place. What was once quiet confidence turns into subtle unease. Not dramatic at first, almost imperceptible, but persistent. This is the moment where anxiety begins to surface. And for the avoidant, this is unfamiliar territory. Because understand this, avoidants are not strangers to emotion. They're strangers to sustained emotional exposure. They've spent years, sometimes a lifetime, learning how to regulate distance, how to suppress intensity, how to exit before things feel overwhelming. But now there's nothing to exit from, no conflict to withdraw from, no conversation to shut down, just silence and themselves. And that's where anxiety thrives. It starts in small ways. A restless thought that interrupts their focus, a sudden urge to check their phone even when there's no notification, a fleeting question. Why haven't they reached out? At first, they dismiss it. They redirect their attention. They tell themselves it's nothing. But the mind, once it begins to question, doesn't easily return to certainty, because now the pattern has been broken. And when a pattern breaks, the brain doesn't feel safe. It feels disoriented. The predictability that once kept everything stable is gone. You're no longer responding the way you used to. You're no longer available in the way they expected. And without that predictability, their internal system starts searching for answers it doesn't have. This is where overthinking begins. They replay past conversations. They analyze moments that once felt insignificant. Things you said, things you didn't say, the tone of your voice, the timing of your distance. And what's interesting is that they're not just remembering, they're reinterpreting. They're trying to reconstruct meaning from a situation they never fully engaged with when it was happening. And that's the paradox. The clarity they avoided in the relationship becomes the confusion they're forced to face in your absence. Sleep might feel different. Focus becomes fragmented. Even moments of distraction don't fully land the way they used to. Because underneath it all, there's a growing tension, an emotional pressure they can't quite define, but can no longer ignore. This isn't panic yet. Not fully. It's the buildup to it. Because anxiety, at its core, is the mind's response to uncertainty. And for the avoidant, uncertainty is far more destabilizing than emotional closeness ever was. Closeness could be controlled, limited, managed, even avoided. But uncertainty, that requires presence. That requires acknowledgement. That requires sitting with something unresolved. And that's exactly what they've spent years trying to escape. So now they find themselves in a position where their usual strategies don't work. Distraction doesn't fully distract. Distance doesn't create relief. Even silence, which once felt safe, now feels heavy. And here's where it gets deeper. Because beneath the anxiety is something they haven't fully named yet: emotional significance. The realization, not fully conscious, but emerging, that your absence is affecting them more than they expected. That maybe, just maybe, you mattered in ways they never allowed themselves to fully recognize. But they don't say that. Not yet. Instead, they stay in the tension, the questions, the internal noise that grows louder the longer it goes unanswered. And this is the turning point, because anxiety doesn't resolve itself through avoidance. It intensifies, it builds, it demands attention, and eventually it forces a confrontation, not with you, but with themselves. Because when silence no longer feels like peace and distance no longer feels like control, there's only one thing left to face: the truth they've been trying not to feel. And as that truth begins to surface, the avoidant finds themselves in a place they've spent most of their life trying to avoid. Not external conflict, but internal contradiction. Because now, it's no longer just anxiety. It's a split, a tension between two powerful forces that don't easily coexist: the ego and attachment. On one side, you have the ego, the carefully constructed identity that says, I don't need anyone. I'm better off alone. Reaching out makes me weak. This voice is familiar. It's practiced. It's been reinforced over time through distance, through self-protection, through the belief that independence equals safety. But on the other side, something quieter begins to speak. Not as loud, not as confident, but far more honest. It's the part of them that remembers how you made them feel. The part that felt understood, even if they didn't fully express it. The part that notices your absence not as inconvenience, but as loss. And now, these two voices are in direct conflict. This is where the avoidant becomes psychologically divided, because the ego demands consistency with the past. Stay distant, stay in control, don't break character. But attachment introduces a new variable. What if you've lost something real? What if this silence isn't a game? And that question disrupts everything, because now reaching out isn't just a simple action, it's a threat to identity. It means admitting that you mattered, that your absence has weight, that the connection wasn't as casual or replaceable as they once believed. And for someone who has built their emotional safety around not needing, that admission feels like exposure. So what do? They hesitate. They think about texting you, but don't. They open your profile, but don't interact. They type a message, then delete it. Over and over again, caught in this loop between impulse and restraint, between feeling and defense. And from the outside, it may still look like nothing is happening. Silence, distance, no movement. But internally, it's chaos. Because indecision is one of the most exhausting psychological states a person can experience. It drains energy. It fragments focus. It keeps the mind locked in a loop with no resolution. And for the avoidant, who is used to clean exits and clear boundaries, this gray area becomes unbearable. They're no longer fully detached, but they're not fully engaged either. They're in between. And that in between is where the real struggle lives, because the ego keeps reminding them of the risks: rejection, vulnerability, loss of control. But attachment keeps reminding them of the cost of doing nothing. And the longer they stay in this state, the more intense the pressure becomes. This is also where subtle behaviors begin to emerge. Indirect signals, passive attempts to reestablish some form of connection without fully stepping into vulnerability. Maybe they like an old post. Maybe they show up in places they know you'll be. Maybe they ask about you through mutual connections. Not because they're ready, but because they're conflicted. And conflict, when unresolved, doesn't stay contained. It escalates. Because at some point, the mind demands alignment. It cannot sustain two opposing truths forever. Either the ego wins and they retreat further into detachment, or attachment breaks through, forcing them to confront what they feel. But here's the reality. By the time they reach this stage, the dynamic has already changed. You're no longer waiting. You're no longer chasing. You've stepped out of the cycle that once gave them the luxury of indecision. And now, their delay has consequences. Because when someone is forced to choose between protecting their ego and honoring their feelings, what they're really choosing is who they're willing to become. And in that moment of hesitation, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The longer they wait to act, the closer they get to losing you for good. And eventually that hesitation reaches its limit, because there's only so long a person can live in internal conflict before something gives. The mind can delay, distract, rationalize, but it cannot indefinitely avoid reality when that reality becomes undeniable. And this is where everything converges. The silence, the absence, the unanswered questions, they all collapse into one overwhelming realization. You're not coming back. This is the moment the avoidant didn't prepare for. Not because they couldn't see it logically, but because they never allowed themselves to feel it emotionally. Up until now, every stage has provided some form of psychological distance. Denial softened the truth, anxiety blurred it, conflict postponed it. But here, there is no buffer left, only impact. And what makes this stage so intense is not just the loss, it's the timing of the awareness. Because they don't just feel that you're gone, they realize when it happened. They begin to connect the dots, the moments they pulled away, the times they minimized your needs, the emotional signals they ignored, and suddenly, what once felt insignificant becomes painfully clear. Regret doesn't arrive as a single thought, it arrives as a flood of recognition. They start to see you differently now, not through the lens of distance, but through the lens of absence. Your consistency, your patience, your effort, things they once took for granted, now stand out with a clarity that wasn't available to them before. And that clarity doesn't bring comfort, it brings weight. Because now the narrative has shifted. It's no longer, I needed space. It's, I lost someone who was willing to stay. And that shift changes everything. This is where emotional panic begins to take form. Not always outwardly, but internally, it's undeniable. The calm detachment they once relied on is gone. In its place is urgency. A need to fix, to understand, to reverse something that no longer feels reversible. But here's the paradox. They don't know how. Because the very skills required in this moment, vulnerability, accountability, emotional expression, are the same skills they've spent years avoiding. So even as the desire to reach out intensifies, the ability to do so feels blocked. And that creates a deeper layer of frustration. They want to act, but don't know how to act effectively. They want to speak, but don't know what to say. And perhaps most painfully, they begin to question whether they even have the right to come back after everything that's happened. This is where the emotional walls they built for protection become their greatest limitation, because those walls were designed to keep discomfort out, but now they're trapping discomfort in. There's no escape route left, no emotional exit, just the full experience of what they've been avoiding, and for the first time, they're not running from you, they're facing themselves. They may replay scenarios in their mind. What if I had said this? What if I had stayed a little longer? What if I had tried? But those questions don't lead to resolution. They lead to realization, a recognition that the opportunity they once had is no longer available in the same way. And that's where the panic deepens. Because it's not just about missing you. It's about understanding that they had you and didn't meet you where it mattered. This stage is not about noise. It's not about dramatic gestures or immediate action. It's about internal collapse. The quiet, heavy awareness that something meaningful has been lost, and that the loss is, in part, self-created. And when that awareness fully settles in, one truth becomes impossible to escape. Sometimes the hardest reality to face isn't that someone left. It's realizing they had every reason to. And after that moment of impact, after the panic, the realization, the weight of what's been lost, something else begins to take shape. Not immediately, not clearly, but inevitably. A decision point. Because once awareness has been reached, it doesn't simply disappear. It demands a response. This is where the avoidant stands at a psychological crossroads, not between you and them, but between who they've been and who they have the potential to become. Because the experience they've just gone through has done something profound. It has disrupted their old emotional framework. The belief that distance equals safety, that detachment prevents pain, that not needing protects them, those ideas have now been challenged by direct experience. And once a belief is challenged by reality, it can no longer exist in the same unquestioned form. So now they're left with two paths. One path is familiar. It's the path of retreat. They take everything they felt, the anxiety, the regret, the panic, and they suppress it. They rationalize it. They tell themselves a story that restores their sense of control. It wasn't meant to be. I'm better off alone. Emotions just complicate things. And slowly, they rebuild the walls, maybe even stronger than before. But here's the cost of that path. Nothing actually changes. The patterns repeat, the distance returns, and the next connection they enter carries the same limitations, the same defenses, the same unaddressed fears. Because growth was available, but it wasn't chosen. The other path is far more difficult, but it's also the only one that leads to transformation. This path requires them to stay with the discomfort instead of escaping it, to examine their own behavior without immediately defending it, to ask deeper questions, not about you, but about themselves. Why did I pull away when things became real? Why did I struggle to express what I felt? Why did I wait until it was too late to recognize what mattered? And those questions don't have easy answers. but they open the door to something avoidants often lack: not intelligence, not awareness, but emotional integration. The ability to align what they feel with how they act. The willingness to be present, even when presence feels uncomfortable. Because real growth isn't about feeling regret, it's about doing something with it. And for some, this is where a shift begins. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. They start to recognize that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's connection. That expressing emotion doesn't create loss, it prevents it. That the very things they avoided were the things that could have sustained something meaningful. Now, does this mean they come back and fix everything? Not necessarily. Because growth doesn't guarantee reconciliation. And sometimes the lesson comes after the opportunity has passed. But even then, the value remains. Because the next time they're faced with connection, they won't be operating from the same unconscious patterns. They'll have awareness. And awareness, when acted upon, becomes change. But here's the truth that brings this full circle. Not everyone chooses that path. Some will feel everything and still go back to who they were, because change requires responsibility, and responsibility requires courage. So the final stage isn't really about you anymore. It's about them deciding whether this experience becomes a turning point or just another suppressed memory. Because when someone is faced with the consequences of their own emotional avoidance, they are given a rare opportunity to either repeat the past or finally break free from it. And in the end, the most powerful shift doesn't come from losing someone. It comes from becoming someone who no longer needs to lose them to understand their value. And when you step back and look at this entire journey, from the illusion of control through denial, anxiety, internal conflict, and finally that moment of emotional impact, you begin to see a pattern that goes far beyond one relationship. This was never just about an avoidant losing someone. It was about what happens when reality confronts avoidance. Because avoidance at its core is not strength, it's delay. It delays truth, it delays growth, it delays the very experiences that give life depth and meaning. And for a while, it works. It creates distance. It creates the illusion of safety. It allows someone to exist without fully engaging. But life has a way of closing that distance. And when it does, when someone is finally faced with the consequences of what they avoided, the experience is not subtle, it's transformative. Not because it's easy, but because it's undeniable. Now here's the part that matters most, and it's not about them, it's about you. When you chose to step away, when you stopped overextending, when you stopped trying to earn clarity from someone committed to distance, you didn't lose control, you reclaimed it. You shifted the dynamic from chasing to choosing, from waiting to walking, from hoping to knowing. And that decision, as simple as it may seem on the surface, is one of the most powerful psychological moves a person can make, because it forces truth to rise, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through absence. And absence, when it's real, reveals everything. It reveals who was invested and who was comfortable. It reveals who grows and who repeats. It reveals whether the connection was built on mutual presence or one-sided persistence. So the real takeaway isn't whether the avoidant panics. It's whether you understand what their panic actually means. It's not love suddenly appearing. It's awareness arriving late. And awareness, no matter how intense, does not undo patterns unless it's followed by change. So as you move forward, the question is no longer, will they come back? The question is, have they become someone different if they do? Because without growth, a return is just a repetition. But with growth, even absence has purpose. And that's the final truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to make someone realize your worth, it's to walk away and let reality do what your presence never could.